big part of our economic base that brings jobs and income into the region and tends to generate prosperity. We go to next slide here. So I asked the question, is logistics a major traded sector in the region? There is emerging literature on this. There's less attention to it. Historically, it was often looked at as a traded sector, and it is in some regions where, again, I'm in Chicago, Los Angeles, it's more of a target industry in those places. But there's been more literature in the last 10 years with the growth on logistics clusters generally. Here are some of the examples of concepts that are coming out of that. It is generally like other traded sector clusters. It's about agglomeration, that most of those companies are concentrated in a few places where they're more competitive. So there is interfirm, there's a lot of firms there, and there's interfirm competition and networking that improves competitiveness of those locations. And there's a lot more innovation that occurs. Those same advantages apply to logistics as other general traded sector clusters. Second, gateway, well, what's more unique about this is it's more of a transportation emphasis. These tend to be essentially described as gateway nodes on global trade routes. And so there's more of a location with transportation, multimodal transportation infrastructure. They rely more on transportation efficiency, and they rely more on frequency of trips within these locations. And what's generating a lot of growth in those locations is more value-added services. So more than what's in the box that got delivered, tagging, sorting, packaging, when it gets delivered, a variety of other things are generating job growth in that sector, as well as a lot of technology around ordering and generally technology in the industry. This is also a unique cluster in that the third point, it's bridging production and consumption. So it's more of a partly traded sector. In comparison, manufacturing is nearly all, in most cases, traded sector types of output and activity, and it's mostly serving markets outside the region. And in distribution, it's almost as much serving regional demand for retailers, for people who live here, delivering boxes now with e-commerce, for wholesaling, for other regional jobs. So it's more of a mix. And then a fourth concept is it's generating a lot more middle wage job growth than many of the other what are often called knowledge clusters that are emphasized. It's not a Silicon Valley, it's creating more middle wage jobs, and it has a benefit of recruiting people with relatively low education levels and give them an opportunity for upward mobility in the labor market. Tom, can you go to the next? So looking at regional data based on that, no, this is looking at specifically Multnomah County data. Typically, it's we look at these at the regional level. A lot of the literature is looking at the big city economies a little bit differently in these logistic hub areas. So this is on Multnomah County data. It looks at the major sector types with high location quotients. Location quotients is comparing the share of jobs in this county to the nation. And so generally transportation is 101.5. It means it's 53% higher concentration of jobs in Multnomah County than there is in the nation. And all of these subsectors too have fairly high location quotients in Multnomah County. It's part of a big city economy portion of the region. A fair amount of firms, when you include wholesale trade with it, comes to about 3,000 firms in Multnomah County that are in these broader trade and logistics cluster. About 55,000 jobs in 2022 is the employment, and they have projected change. I show projected change, substantial growth, transportation and warehousing sector in the Oregon Employment Department forecast 1.2% growth to 2032. and 0.9% growth in wholesale trade. So substantial growth is projected also in these Multnomah County clusters. Generally, the traded sectors nationally have been haven't generated as much middle wage job growth, or haven't generated as much job growth. So there's an opportunity for a little faster job growth, and it varies a lot by region. Tom, can we go to the next slide? I mentioned one of the concepts for logistics clusters is being in nodes of global supply routes or global trade routes. Portland is shown here on this two maps, is one of the four trade gateways, freight gateways nationally on the West Coast along the Pacific Rim. Generally, we've had more growth in the last 3 decades in Asian economy and in Pacific Rim countries. So we've had a lot more global trade, and it's been important as a gateway for the region. And this map shows numbers by the red is highway numbers and the green is rail numbers, batter lines. And then the second chart is an old map with ODOT data that shows where that flow happens within the state of Oregon, and essentially at a multimodal level, and it comes together in not only Portland, but Portland's industrial district specifically. So hub location. Tom, can you go to the next slide? I'm looking at it in a different way. This is a map is a PBOT map of those used in the 2040 freight plan. The gray areas are the prime industrial areas in the city, and it's generally showing multimodal freight hub infrastructure. So the freeways where the two national interstate highways come together in Oregon or in Portland is shown in yellow. The BNSF and UP rail lines are shown in orange, and the rail yards are shown there as well. The harbor is shown there as the deep water channel. Those blue dots of the harbor, there are about 50 active or docks, industry, marine industrial facilities. The black dots are more truck terminals that are especially along I-5, but a lot of them in Swan Island as well. And then the airport. The red in there are distribution buildings, such larger scale warehouse buildings. The green are other warehouse buildings. They tend to be smaller warehouse buildings. So we have a strong concentration in the city of Portland. Tom, can you go to the next slide? This is another map of it at the regional level in terms of jobs. This shows industry type jobs in 3 colors. The blue is manufacturing jobs. Wholesale trade is shown in red, and transportation and warehousing are shown in green in the 7-county area. So in the city of Portland, a lot of job growth, and it's more diverse generally than the rest of the region. But the transportation and warehousing jobs and transportation, warehousing jobs and wholesale jobs are very much concentrated in the city of Portland compared to the rest of the region. And a lot of the outlying locations are much more manufacturing oriented, not in the hub in the center of the region.
Steph, we're trying to hold questions till the end unless you have a technical need.
Actually, my need, I just want to, we're about halfway through this slide deck.
I got 4 more slides.
Okay. Okay.
So this is looking at the urban design issues. Urban logistic hub locations like Portland in the center of the region, do they make long-term sense as Portland continues to grow? So we had questions that came up here about what's the job density in logistics and warehousing and freight movement compared to other building types. This is a chart that shows trends, or it shows actually, trends of building square foot per job, average floor area ratio, and essentially that leads to jobs per acre estimates of each of these building types. We've had a trend toward increasing job density in the warehouse and freight movement building types. We've had some increasing or declining job density in some of the other industrial types, both in industrial services and manufacturing. Generally now, warehouse and freight movement buildings are comparable to the other these other lower density urban uses, 10 to 15 jobs per acre in those areas for these different building types, including colleges. Retail sales is a little bit higher, but if you look at big box and some of the retail sales, it's lower. And office jobs are really the outlier that has a higher job density in the upper floors, and it's 275 jobs per acre. But the rest of the economy is a lot of it is in that lower density urban design types. Go to the next slide. We also asked about job or site size for new construction in transportation and warehousing. So here I'm showing the the share of total growth that's shown in the forecast. So it is both new square footage as well as new jobs by site size that are in the projections. And again, it's based on trends by site size from the last business cycle. And it shows that warehouse and distribution, we have a big concentration of 20 acres and larger in the recent trends, 40%. So I showed the darker blue as bigger concentrations. And in comparison, manufacturing and general industrial have a 40% or higher in this other 1 to 3 acre size. But other than that, most of the jobs and most of the growth is it's kind of spread out in those other site sizes. So besides that concentration, it's been there. And then if you look at other locations, this is just based on City of Portland data. In much of the region, you see much larger site sizes for manufacturing as well, particularly in Hillsborough. You're not seeing as much of that just by the trend in the City of Portland. To the next slide. So this is looking at total industrial building construction in the region, 7-county region, since 1990. And the colors here show the dark red is more recent construction, and the light yellow is older construction back to 1990. Basically shows that we've continued to get a lot of the industrial development in the City of Portland and Columbia Corridor particularly. And we're getting it in a variety of site sizes as well. So all site sizes, and throughout this period, we've continued to be a relatively competitive location.
Do the circle sizes represent the size of sites or the number of sites that are within that spot?
It's a size of new construction, new buildings. And there's overlap there, obviously, too. I have a couple more, I think. What? Oh, yeah. So getting at another issue for urban.
We wanted to stop. We need to allow time for us.
Okay, I can stop there.
I feel there are questions in this room, so I'm wondering who would like to start. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Steph, do you have questions remaining? Thank you for holding.
I honestly, I don't know even where to begin. And I'm just gonna, I just want to comment on a frustration that I have right now, that this is a lot. This isn't, to me, this feels like an onslaught of information. We didn't have access to it before. I don't know how to engage with this information in this room. I'm curious. I'm curious what we are expected to do in this conversation. I'm going to be honest, this feels numbing. This feels like a numbing amount of information without prior context.
Can I want to jump in here. It's Patricia. First of all, I think we heard a lot of comments about wanting to see information in advance. To be honest with you, we were working on these slides until this morning. I mean, I'm just going to be really honest, right? Because it is a lot of information and you're going to hear similar information from different groups on different topics. So that, but also I'd like to sort of remind folks that this is in response to questions you've asked. So we're trying to answer questions you've asked. And a lot of this information actually has been shared previously. It's just that we're trying to pull information together in such ways to provide like a story arc to like continue to reinforce the topics that we're grappling with and how to use this information to start thinking about priorities, alternatives, scenarios, etc. So, Steph, I appreciate what you're saying, and I'm sorry that it feels that way. And all of everything that we produce in these meetings ends up being posted online. They're available to you to review after as well and come back to us with questions, clarifications. So say all this to say that we've been trying to manage the flow of work as well as we can. And this is, this information is responsive to questions you've had.
Shay, and then I'll come to Bob and Sarah. Yep.
Hi, everybody. Shay Flaherty-Bitting here. And Steve, thanks for the data. I'm curious, you mentioned kind of how you're thinking about transportation as a traded sector cluster. And I think we've historically thought of them as what's bringing in money from outside the region. It sounds like this is a sector that depends on some of that outside activity and other firms' activity in order to have the kind of robust numbers you see here. So I'm curious, does it display as a cluster the amount of kind of the human capital and innovation? Like, are we specifically developing new warehouse transportation technologies and building out that human capital? Or is it that it's growing because we have all this other activity happening across clusters that might be called out in the city's growth strategy? I'm just thinking of, firms like Daimler, right, who are moving the needle in terms of developing potentially new electrified freight, right, controlling 40% of the current stock nationwide. Is that being counted as transportation? We traditionally think of that as more of a both manufacturing and climate tech. So how is that all playing out when you think about growth?
Yeah, it's a different type of a cluster. It's about 50 to 60% traded sector activity versus close to 100% traded activity. These aren't the global clusters that are unique in this region that have a high location quotient for the region. Instead, they are more of a mix. They support local commerce as well as production. So Daimler is a driver. They are service as part of the supply chain for production, as well as agricultural, statewide, and generally the region. And they're also serving both. So it's a mix. And the literature on it is more emerging. I found a lot more in the last month on much has been written, much has been written internationally and some in this country as well on logistics clusters. So they are there's more of a transportation emphasis. But much of the typical traded sector cluster agglomeration characteristics also occur here. That it's a agglomeration that's concentrated in a particular area. There's competition and networking of a lot of firms in the area that produce innovation and produce a lot of higher wage jobs, but it's mostly middle wage jobs. It's less of a knowledge sector type of industry. So it is different.
Get one more.
Yeah, I think after we hear some other questions, Bob, I know you have a question. I think what it would be interesting to do, and this is sort of in response to Steph's question as well, is like we presented this information because there were questions about the quality of these jobs. So rather than getting too stuck on the topic just in service of the topic itself, let's think about how this topic informs what we're talking about. Because also we know that, and Steve showed this type of industry, these businesses require large sites. They have a high demand for large sites. And we also know that we don't have a bunch of large sites in the city to accommodate those uses. So I think there's a balance, as with everything, there's a balance to strike between understanding that these are a source of jobs that are an important part of the economy for important segments of our population. But at the same time, the reality is, and I think this is true, and this is something that I want to ask staff to explore more, is that cities that are in this stage of urbanization, right, fairly built out, it's like there are limits to how much of these types of uses they can accommodate. And I think it would be interesting for us to look at other cities and understand how, as cities evolve and space becomes more constrained, how do they respond to these needs? And how do, goods will still flow. It's just that, there will have to be more efficiencies, or something will have to happen in the market, right? So I would just like to make sure that we don't get too fixated on this information just for the information itself, but rather what is this information trying to help us figure out in the context of what we're here to do with the EOA.
I'm Patricia, thank you for that. I mean, that's what my question's getting at, right? By the use of those large sites, are we becoming the transportation hub for a region, and are those higher quality jobs going to surrounding jurisdictions?
Yeah.
It's just a concern when I see that thing.
Thank you. Bob, please.
Your comment got at my question, but I'm gonna go back to Steph's, and I know you're not gonna like it, but I'm gonna go back to it because I found your answer incredibly defensive, frankly. I appreciate your presentation, Steve, but there was an incredible amount of information. I couldn't even read the numbers before the slides changed, and we just got, 23 slides of numbers, charts, graphs. Some of them, there was no way, and I've done a lot of this stuff, for me to process what I just saw and turn it into a coherent question, or turn it into, I'm gonna have to go back and read it after the fact, but the meeting's already gone by. And my expectation of this process, we're all giving our time, where our time is all valuable, is we get information in advance. We have, especially something like this, and we have the opportunity to review it, come in, and that we're not just flooded. This is information overload, and that's a strategy the city sometimes uses, and it's really damn unfortunate. I feel like my time is being wasted today. And I found your answer, frankly, again, defensive. It was kind of like, that's your problem, not ours. We're trying hard. Now, let me finish. And so I think this information is complicated for folks that don't work in this arena. It's kind of Greek to us. And I have a lot of questions, but I don't even know what they are. And basically what this says to me is, we're going to throw a whole lot of numbers at you. We're going to overwhelm you, and trust us. And now, how does this fit in? Your comment gets at my question, which is, the question for me ultimately is, how does this fit in? Are these numbers predicated on what? If it's a status quo, do these numbers occur? If it's, if we find more land, if we don't find more land, how do these numbers change depending on what happens on our landscape going forward? What is the basic premise? But yeah, I'm as frustrated as I've been in this process right now. I feel like this was an unacceptable situation, and I appreciate your work on this, Steve, but please don't ever bring us in and hit us with something like this again.
Bob? Sarah?
I have something more, I think related to what you said, which is, I'd like to know the age of the people working in warehouses, particularly in North Portland. You know that I am here to advocate for the people in the industrial sector that live there and have been damaged by the Superfund and by the CI hub. And, we were just given a big slap in the face by BES regarding the people who live in North Portland. So I am not backing off today. I do field trips for Roosevelt High School because I did not separate out who was an immigrant, who was Black. We didn't get funded this year because I wasn't supposed to teach a whole class about the river and the North Portland. I was only supposed to teach immigrants. I have an immigrant family. They would think it was completely rude to walk up to a student at Roosevelt High School and ask if they were an immigrant. How am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to take attendance? So I want to tell you what happened at that trip. where I did not take attendance based on the color of people's skins and reported to BPS. The rudest city thing I have ever heard of. But I want to tell you what they told me. They said the students at Roosevelt are being recruited by the warehouses to work, and they come to school with no sleep because they can get $25 an hour and they're not going to graduate. So what is happening? You don't recruit kids out of Roosevelt to go work in that sector and then say you're supplying jobs for kids who don't have a high school diploma. That's immoral. If you don't have enough people for the jobs who are not high school students, who are trying to earn enough money for their clothing, that's wrong. And they said that's what's happening. They're being recruited out of Roosevelt. It's not okay. So I need to see the ages of the people who are driving those Amazon trucks. I need to see the ages of the people who are sorting in these warehouses and what their shifts are. If they're working all night as teenagers, they said some of them aren't even 18. This is what the teachers are telling me about what's going on over there. And you want more acres for that? How about keeping these kids in high school? Why isn't that our goal? Giving them apprenticeships and internships. Why don't we have, and I know that's your job, is not schools. I just want you to know that how people are treated in North Portland is breaking my heart, and it's not getting any better. And this scenario of recruiting teenagers out of high schools, not okay.
I think with this, I mean, there's, this is a land supply and job projection exercise, right? There's a lot of issues. You've raised a lot of different issues. I do think it speaks to, we have to think about this very holistically. What are the job training? What's the workforce development opportunities? I mean, we have to, this is only going to address kind of one aspect of the overall economic future of the city. We have partners that work on a lot of other arenas to help address some of the issues that you're talking about, right? And we have to, through this process, I would love it if we could identify more programs, more things that we should be exploring and trying to do as a city to address the host of issues.
Okay, I'm just asking for age. All I'm asking for is age and shifts. That's all I'm asking for, age and shifts of these jobs and how long they stay in those jobs. Are these long-term careers or are these picking up some dollars? That's what I'm asking for.
Thank you. I see Steve writing it down. We'll look into that and get back to you all. Corky and then Shay, and then I think we're gonna have to. Oh, thank you. So Corky, and then we'll bring us to a close.
So I guess, obviously there's some frustration. This is the sort of presentation some of us were asking early on in this process, and we didn't have time, understandable. It's great that we've come to it right now. It is a fire hose, absolutely. I'm familiar with the data and I'm still going, whoa, yeah. But this is the economic opportunities analysis, right? And this is probably the deepest we've gotten into economic opportunities the entire time we've been meeting. So in that sense, I welcome it, and I would just caution us to not shoot the messenger. It's unfortunate that we've got to do it at this stage and we have to do it with fire hose. But I think staff is doing what they can to manage that. So I defend them a little bit in that regard. Specifically to a little bit of what Shay and Sarah just brought up too, about, should we be aiming for higher quality jobs? Shay mentioned the higher quality jobs, maybe going to other locations. I think that's, again, in terms of economic opportunities analysis, we should be looking at that. But I will say that, and this is a little bit of what Sarah's asking about too, I think, is that we need to make sure that we don't abandon our population that doesn't have as much opportunity. So those are the people that, for whatever reason, can't or won't go to a 4-year degree university. There's a lot of them. You know, and if we, for example, I know this is not what you're intending, Shay, but if we, for example, say, you know what, we're just going to focus on people that go to university, then we abandon a very important part of our population. I think, you know, remember what was in some of those early slides is the opportunity in this sector and that Steve just described for BIPOC, for people without 4-year degrees, is better than any other sector we can find. This is great. This is wonderful news. We're doing something really good here. Let's not handicap ourselves on that, and let's not fight back on that. I mean, let's welcome that message, I think, would be my suggestion. So it's not really a question, I'm sorry, but thanks for the opportunity to hopefully put it in perspective a little bit, and apologize for the overwhelming amount of data.
Thank you, Corky. And Steph, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
No, and I just want to appreciate that framing because, yeah, to me, this feels like an initial briefing, which is great. Like, this is wonderful information. It's going to take a lot to process. I can promise you that I will have so many questions and would love to follow up with staff. I hear it said, I hear it said that, you know, y'all were working on these slides until this morning. I just hope that, like, that we can have an opportunity for a deeper conversation, which I can imagine like today is not that day. But yeah, I appreciate the information. Just like as Bob said, like this is a lot. And as Corky also said, so yeah, a lot of information. I guess initial questions kind of related to what we were talking about last time is, you know, when we're talking about warehousing and we are talking about some of these uses as kind of like jobs per acre, and, you know, looking at what is the how are we looking at this in terms of verticality versus, you know, acreage horizontally, if that makes sense. Also, I'm interested in learning, like, what is the relationship between middle wage jobs and living wage jobs, and how our cost of living in this region is mapping to the potential for wage increases within these sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you for contributing to that, and all of you. You're already sensing it. I think that will be the future of our discussions, are talking about these balances. There's the opportunity, but at what cost? And there could be some concerns about who's being hired. There could be some concerns about it not being living wage. And then maybe there are other opportunities for the land that we're not pursuing if we pursue these. So these are all part of the mix, and I appreciate you all digging in. Yeah, it's unfortunate that there's frustrations and it's been a fire hose of information, but we will do our best to continue the conversation. Speaking of, I'm going to move us on to the next topic. Again, responding to some outstanding questions. Daniel and Jeff, you two are up.
Tom, are you able to present my presentation as well?
Yeah.
You don't have another part.
So I was just gonna say, this could be viewed as another fire hose, but this is again, information in context of previous information we've shown and elaborating as a result of questions that have been asked.
Deb,
Yes, Ben.
because as you guys are having a discussion, I went back and looked at the agenda just to see all the things we're going to try to accomplish today. And there's like 4 major topics, right? So given the discussion we just had, I'm wondering if we should revisit the agenda and make sure we're addressing all the necessary questions and inquiries that have even just came up in the last discussion before we try to throw a bunch more information on people.
I think that's a really good fair question.
Yep.
And if it's more useful for us to delve more deeply in a topic and take time rather than introduce new information, I think that's totally fair and reasonable. And
Thank-
so,
Thank you for posing the question, Benton. Yeah, so maybe to frame it up, we could continue, we could go back and maybe slow down and go over some of the information from Steve's presentation regarding jobs forecasting and talk more about these potential trade-offs and opportunities. If that feels like the right time, if you all would prefer to wait until you get the slide deck, spend time studying it, come back and have that conversation, that's another option. Anyone have feelings one way or the other? And then we could rearrange the rest of the agenda based on that. Or am I missing an option?
I'm ready to jump into it, but I'm thinking about, if I were Bob, if I were Sarah, I'd probably say, you know, hey, I want to look at these slides and then come back at the next meeting and have a really good, healthy, robust conversation. I don't mean to speak for you, but nobody else was speaking up, so I'm speaking for you.
Together, yes. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, I need some time to process the information and dig down. I appreciate the suggestion for sure. I just feel like, and I probably want to meet with Steve between now and the next meeting, you know, and get my ducks in a row. And I don't mean to blast you, Patricia, but I just think when your group tells you that it was too much, too fast, and they didn't have time to prepare, I think
Sure.
It's not, well, you should deal with it. It's you should, what can we do to help instead? So, yeah, I mean, I'm probably done with this for today,
Okay.
at least personally, so speaking for myself.
before we leave the topic,
Thank you.
can I just pose one question to the group, which is, I think what you're hearing in this information is an interest in trying to make sure that as we think about future job growth and the economy overall, how do we ensure that we cultivate middle wage jobs? I mean, I think, so it's, I don't think it's necessarily that we're saying that this is the only way to do it. It's just that this is what we see here is that we have an existing context that's supportive of this kind of job, right? We have the node, the infrastructure, et cetera. And so if there are, and I think, Shay, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know we've had conversations about like, where can we draw more connections between the advanced Portland, you know, strategy, and think about where do we have strengths as a city, and where can we cultivate, what can we do to cultivate middle wage jobs in the different sectors that we have strengths in as a city. And so I would just pose to the group that we're not presenting this information to say that we think this is absolutely the only way to go in terms of middle wage jobs, but rather how do we know, I think we have shared values of wanting to make sure that the growth is inclusive and that we can, you know, have middle wage jobs in the future in whatever sectors that really are beneficial to the overall economic vitality of the city.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think when we think about it and we think about where we have success in our current workforce development investments, certainly, commercial truck, all the licenses, like those are great entry level jobs, especially for folks who can do the training, who can participate in the programming. And you have folks coming out of houselessness or incarceration who can get to those 50K, 60K level jobs. I think where we see the current trends in the economy, where we have concerns are we losing our competitiveness because those firms that are actually driving innovation and are driving the demand for a lot of that warehouse transportation, right? That's where we think about the gross regional product of our region. What's bringing in outside money? What are bringing in either federal contracts or, larger other corporate contracts? We know that we're going to continue to have this concentration of warehousing and medical, but that's still us trading amongst ourselves. That's not growing opportunity. I hear you, Corky, on the accessibility of the jobs. I do think access to the middle wage jobs is both important in terms of how we maintain this and how we maintain our manufacturing capacity, acknowledging that it's shrinking over time. But we can't lose sight of the growth. That's kind of what I'm trying to hold, is that these, as long as we have the firms that are actually driving the growth and are driving our competitiveness, these folks will come to this market and they'll find a way. But how are we making sure that we hold our priorities straight with those priority industries that are driving our region forward?
Thank you. So, Benton, do you have another?
Yeah, if we're gonna move on, can I just ask Steve a question?
Yeah,
It's the kind of
please.
question I'm gonna forget that I had.
Yeah.
I think one framing, as we've been through this conversation, I think one framing piece that I'm kind of wrapping my head around is every sector has a mix of jobs.
Mhm.
And the Portland's previous growth strategies were designed to create some low to middle, some pathway, right, type of job. So ground floor retail is a minimum wage job, right, versus what's happening in the second to the 10th floor of that building, whatever, right? So looking at this data similarly, do we have information on who the people working in the low to mid-tier income range are in some of these jobs? As compared to the other sectors in Portland's economy, and should we look at that data in that way, that this is a sector like every other sector that has a range of types of jobs from an income threshold, and are they about the same, different, who works in them, how many people, et cetera? And then maybe we can identify, I think back to your question, Patricia, do we have an imbalance or not? And if we don't, maybe this is actually really good data for us to say we should be investing in this sector as a result.
So, yeah, it's a good question. I had one kind of overview slide of major types of middle wage occupations, and it looks at education level for those. I had other slides that I didn't really get to showing education level across the city in different census tracts, and East Portland is still majority people that don't have a bachelor's degree. And we've had changes in the city, but much of the city continues to be in the types of population that work in these sectors that depend on minimum wage jobs. You're right, all of the sectors have a mix of occupations, and the occupations have a mix of wage distribution. So we go with the general statistics on wage distribution. So it's coming from a starting point where we've been fairly flat with middle wage job growth in the last couple of decades. It's like, if you look at all jobs in the economy, the middle half of the wage distribution in terms of occupations has not been growing. So where are the opportunities to grow that? Because we're growing haves and have-nots in terms of the economy. So it particularly benefits people without bachelor's degrees who are in the low wage jobs as an alternative. So these are not target industries, but transportation and warehousing and healthcare jobs have a big impact there, as well as a lot of the downtown office jobs that are admin jobs that have big labor market benefits across the region and in city Portland as well.
So just so I make sure I understand what you're saying, the benefit of this sector is really in the potential growth of middle wage jobs. It is not in the stratification of jobs from top to bottom. It's that this is a real opportunity. And pretty much all the wages you put up there were somewhere in the middle wage range, right? Like on the chart, there were really no very low or very high, right?
Should I do the smiley chart? Do we have just a second? Because I think this speaks to his question. And this is Steve's data. Everybody knows about the middle wage job gap, right? So, which is basically like this. So, number of jobs, and this is low wage, middle wage, and high wage. So, and I'm exaggerating here, of course, but we have a lot of low wage jobs in general throughout the country. We have a lot of low wage jobs, we got a lot of high wage jobs. Middle wage jobs, they're decreasing, and this gap is getting deeper and wider. Obviously, I'm exaggerating here, but you know, you get the idea. If we chart out, it's all jobs for the country. If we chart out industrial jobs, And that's, I think, one of the big values. Am I misrepresenting that, Steve?
That's right.
Okay, so I guess what I'm getting at here is when this goes to your question, right? Which is, why does this information matter? I think it was a good question to ask. What are these jobs? How much do they pay? Who is working in them, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is that it's kind of, I think what we've been saying for several months here is this is a critical sector, even the new jobs that I think there's been some concern about related to warehousing and transportation. They are critical to the building the actual family wage and middle income job sector in this region and in Portland in particular. And so when we go for our future conversation down the road here about why is this important and how much land do we need, that chart's going to be very, very important. And I think it's really important to think about it from the perspective of we may not all like them. Like not everybody wants to work in a warehouse, but not everybody wants to work in retail either. And there are realities about opportunities needing to exist for people who have to, who either for some reason need a job right then, don't have the education that they need to get the next level job, or need a step. That's why these jobs are. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other, so just to clarify too, we are going to, I believe, based on this conversation, put a pause so that everyone has a chance to dig in a little bit more on the information. We'll share the slide deck. I know there's some outstanding questions about sort of who's serving in those lower tier wages and the warehouse and distribution, as well as including age and maybe just other demographics. So put a pin in that. We'll come back and talk about that some more. And especially as we talk about those trade-offs of land intensiveness, is that a word? And then sort of what some of the potential outcomes are and who these jobs are fulfilling and other job opportunities outside of warehouse and distribution. Any last minute thoughts or questions on that? We're going to take a very hard pivot here and talk about some follow-up questions on the environmental. And then after that, let's take a little break and come back and we'll move on to the rest of the agenda. At the break, I'll look at the agenda and make sure we have the right setup here. But go ahead, Daniel and Jeff, for real this time. Thank you.
I'm hoping that this will be a little less numbers heavy, but it is wonky. But I want to welcome questions at any point. I don't want to wait till the end. So we will have multiple points to stop along the way with this discussion. Next slide, please, Tom. There we go. So yeah, so the topics that we're looking at, we had questions about natural resource inventory and what it is. So I presented to this group in November. I talked about the E-zone scenarios. I said they're all based on the NRI, and a lot of people had questions about what exactly that is. Is the NRI the same as Title 13 that Metro requires us for natural resource protections? What are the differences, and are the proposals that we have for natural resource protections in line with what our peer cities are doing? And then Jeff has got some further follow-up on the Willamette North region and that upcoming project that may happen down the road at some point. So we'll start with this NRI. Next slide, please. So what is the NRI? A key component of the NRI is the riparian resource rankings. So how are those calculated? How do those compare to Title 13? How are those NRI rankings used to generate these scenarios? And the peer cities that we want to look at is Oregon City, the Clean Water Services jurisdiction, which is the whole Tualatin Valley, all these cities that are within that. Banks, Hillsborough, King City, Sherwood, Tiger, Tualatin, they all have the same environmental regulations when it comes to riparian resources. And then the city of Seattle, which is obviously not in Portland or exactly in our region, but is a good peer city for comparison in terms of natural resource protections and regulations. Next slide, please. So NRI, I told you before, but let's recap on this. It is what we use in the city of Portland to map natural resources. It started with the Metro Title 13 methodology. They had a methodology for mapping natural resources. Metro did this as part of their regional growth management functional plan. They included environmental regulations in there. Portland worked with Metro to refine the rules and regulations that were in Title 13, and we created our own inventory in collaboration with Metro. In 2012, Metro determined that our whole natural resource protection program was in substantial compliance with Title 13, and part of that compliance piece was this NRI. So Metro agreed that this is substantially compliant with Title 13, but it was also a fine tuning and refinement of the rules that Metro used. And at the same time that Portland, that Metro agreed that Portland was in substantial compliance, Portland and Metro entered into an intergovernmental agreement in which we said that we are going to update environmental regulations in the Columbia corridor and in the north reach of the Willamette River and other areas of the city. So we've been on the same page with Metro going back a decade that this natural resource inventory is consistent with Metro regulations and that we're going to use it to update E-zones going forward. Next slide, please. So what's included in the NRI? What features are mapped? These are the same features that were mapped in Metro's methodology in their inventory. And what they are is water bodies, which include streams, rivers, wetlands, and other ponds and lakes and things like that. It's a mapping of steep slopes. It's a mapping of floodplains and a mapping of 4 distinct vegetation types: forest, woodland, shrubland, and herbaceous. So these same categories, if you look at Metro's regulations, Metro's applying regulations to the same categories, and we're mapping them in the same way. We're using remote sensing. So we're using aerial imagery and we're using LiDAR to determine where these resources are located. And I want to pause really quick and see if there's any questions so far on what I've presented. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so we take those features that I talked about before, water features, steep slopes, and vegetation. We've got this riparian ranking methodology that's built into the NRI. There's a descriptive description of how it works. And what we're saying is there are 6 categories of riparian functions that are important. We've got a model that determines, is a resource important in one of these 6 categories? And the way that we do that is with the buffer analysis. We say, there's vegetation out there and there's a wetland out there. How close are they to each other? Is that forest vegetation within 50 feet of the wetland, or is it within 100 feet of that wetland? And if it's within a specific range category, then we say it's got a function in one of these categories here. And so any particular feature could have a primary or secondary function in each of these categories. Next slide, please. Yeah, I can give a couple of examples of features that would have a primary function in one of those categories. So for example, for the microclimate and shade category, can we go back one slide really quick? For the microclimate and shade category, which is category number 1 on here, if you had a forest, a patch of forest vegetation that's within 100 feet of a river, stream, or a wetland, it would get a primary function in that category, in that one category. Then you move down to the next category. If you go down to, say, category 4, which is large wood and channel dynamics, forest vegetation within 150 feet of a river or stream would get a primary function in that category. So there's 6 categories. You could have up to 6 primary functions. And if you don't get a primary function, you might get a secondary function in that category. So does that make sense? Next slide. So once we look at these individual rankings in those 6 categories, we aggregate them to make a combined score. So the highest score you can get is 6 primary functions in all 6 of those categories. Some features, if you're really close to a water body, might get all 6. Other ones might get less. You get a high ranking if you have at least 4 primary functions in those categories. You get a medium ranking if you have a 1 to 3. So if any 3 of those functions are hitting as a primary score, the resource will be a 3. Low ranking are only secondary functions. We generally ignore the low rankings. We don't usually apply E-zones to them, but the model does include those low rankings. So have them listed here, but from this point on, we can ignore low and we're just looking at the high functions. And these are consistent with how Metro ranks resources as well. We have riparian rankings, they have riparian classifications. The categories that we're using are consistent with the categories that were used by Metro for Title 15. Next slide, please. So we're running this model, we're churning out these aggregate scores. It seems a little complicated, but we get consistent results. And these tables are summarizing those consistent results. And I understand that it's kind of hard as we're sitting here in the back of the room to see this. But on the left side of the screen is the NRI outputs. On the right side of the screen is Title 13. And this is just for streams. So we're looking at riparian vegetation in proximity to streams. Tom, can you hover over the herbaceous category, which is the second line? Yeah, okay, so on the left is the NRI, and you can see that we are only applying riparian rankings to herbaceous vegetation within 50 feet of a stream. If you look over at the Metro Title 13 side, they're applying category scores up to 200 feet away from that stream. So for herbaceous vegetation, the NRI is undervaluing herbaceous vegetation relative to Title 13. Title 13 says if you got herbaceous vegetation on steep slopes within 200 feet of a stream, we're applying a ranking to it. NRI says no, we're stopping at 50. So that's a distinction, the difference between the NRI and Title 13. Most other cases were pretty similar in terms of how we're doing the rankings. The other place there's a key difference is in the forest vegetation. They rank forest vegetation within 150 feet, regardless of slope steepness. We only extend that ranking out to 100. For streams, we're remarkably similar in our scoring systems. And I did a calculation, and within the project area where we're talking about the Columbia corridor, there's about 126 acre difference between our ranking and their ranking in terms of high and medium resources. That's in an area where there are 7,500 acres of resources. So it's much less than 1% difference in terms of the total area covered by these rankings. Next slide is wetlands.
So I think also there's general equivalence between the medium ranking and the class 2, the way in which Metro looks at, so that's why there's we're kind of comparing the same coloring. You can kind of see what we do versus the sort of basis that was the Metro methodology.
And actually, before we move to the next slide, are there any questions at this point about how these rankings are scored and how they compare? Any notable differences that people see? Okay, next slide. So that was just streams. This is wetlands. I think the key point here to take home is that our wetland classification is identical, our classification for wetlands is identical as it is to streams, whereas there's a little bit of a difference between how Metro treats wetlands and streams. So can you go back to the streams again? So you see this is wetlands, and then go to streams really quick. So you see there's a slight difference in Metro's classification, but we treat streams and wetlands the same in our system. And where that difference is notable, I think, is on the developed areas. So in the top row right there, we classify all land within 50 feet of both streams and wetlands as being a ranking resource. Metro does that for streams, but not for wetlands. So we treat wetlands as being the exact same as streams in all cases, and Metro doesn't always do that. The majority of wetlands are overlapping with streams. So in effect, the distinction looks bigger here than it really is, because most of the wetlands are actually right on top of a stream. But in cases where you have an isolated wetland that's not overlapping with the stream, there is some differences between our system and Metro's system. The other difference is on the steep slopes. Our vegetation classification goes out to 200 feet if there's steep slope land adjacent to a wetland. Metro stops at 100 or 150 vegetation types, but there's not a whole lot of steeply sloped land in the industrial areas. So that is actually a smaller difference than what it would appear in these graphics. Any questions about wetlands and streams and the differences in rankings? Okay, so there's one more category that we have, and that's floodplains. So where these features are in, and this is unprotected floodplains, this is not within the MCDD levee drainage districts, but outside of those drainage districts, there's a slight difference, and that is that Metro in their Title 13 is applying rankings to vegetation that's contiguous to the floodplain, whereas we're only applying the regulations to vegetation that's within the floodplain. So that's another distinction between our classification systems. But again, Metro has found our ranking system to be substantially compliant with their ranking system, and we did this. The changes that we made were done in conjunction with Metro staff in collaboration, and they found our system to be substantially compliant with their regulations. So we use these rankings, these NRI rankings, to generate our draft scenarios for E-zone. Remember, we have 3 scenarios, and that's what's shown on this next slide here. So there's a low scenario, which is the minimum, which is a difference from the existing E zones. It would be a change from the existing E zones. There's a climate resilient scenario, which is a slightly higher application of E zones than the minimum. And then there's the maximum scenario. And there's some differences in how these scenarios are mapped, but they're all reliant on these riparian resource rankings. So that minimum scenario is applying conservation zone to only the high ranking resources. It's ignoring those medium ranking resources. And then it's applying P zone within the streams and within the wetlands, but there's no P zone buffers around those features. The climate resilient scenario is applying E zones to all high and medium ranking resources. And there are some P zone buffers. And then there's a maximum scenario where it's got bigger P zone buffers, but it's pretty similar in terms of the total area covered to the climate resilient scenario. So these are our three scenarios. And the next question we were trying to address is, how do these proposed E zone protections compare to our peer cities, peer jurisdictions nearby? And so that's the next slides are going to be that peer analysis. But before we jump into this, I want to give another chance for questions. Does anybody have any questions about the E zone scenarios or how the NRI rankings feed into those scenarios? So the cities, the peer cities that we looked at are in the top left hand of this graphic. So again, clean water services. That's the sewer and stormwater jurisdiction for the entire Tualatin Valley watershed. So that's about half of the metro region basically is within the Clean Water Services jurisdiction. And all the cities that are within the Clean Water Services jurisdiction rely on Clean Water Services regulations for their Title 13 compliance. So the rules that are imposed by Clean Water Services are the rules that are in place for banks, and they're the rules that are in place for Beaverton and Tigard and Tualatin and all those cities that are in the Tualatin River watershed. So those, and what we're looking at on this graph here is the buffer sizes that are used in their regulatory systems for what resources are protected. So Clean Water Services, the top left-hand corner, that's like half the metro region. Oregon City, also in the metro region, also in compliance with Title 13, and then Seattle. Seattle is not obviously compliant with Title 13 or Goal 5, but they have their own land use planning system, and they have requirements for natural resource protections, which are pretty similar to what Oregon does. And so what we're looking at here is just the regulations that apply to wetlands and what kind of buffers we're applying to them. The upper right-hand corner is those three scenarios, and those are the buffers that we are proposing in our scenarios. And this is a lot of numbers, but I mean, I think the take-home message here is that the buffer ranges that we have are pretty consistent with buffer ranges that our peer cities are applying. The only time that we're getting out to those 200-foot buffers that you see on our scenarios is when there is vegetation extending 200 feet away from the feature. Usually it's going to be forest vegetation, not herbaceous, and it's usually where there are steep slopes, which there are not a lot of the Columbia corridor. So in effect, you're not getting those 200-foot buffer sizes almost ever in most of the project area, except for in places where there's vast tracts of forest around riparian water features, which are typically parks and open space land that's been set aside. There's not a whole lot of development sites that people aren't actually removing the trees actively to maintain them as active development sites. So even though we're showing 200-foot buffers in these scenarios, the 200-foot buffers are only really applying to larger sites that are usually natural resource tracts that have already been set aside for conservation.
And actually, this brings up just, and there wasn't mentioned, but one of the things is our minimum criteria is half an acre for the vegetation. It has to be at least half an acre to be considered and to be ranked. And going back to those different, the comparisons between the NRI and the Title 13. One difference is that Metro looks at a full acre is the minimum size of a vegetation patch, and we have gone down to half an acre. So in terms of those further out areas, again, if you have forested area that's adjacent to a wetland, it needs to be at least half an acre that to be included in this buffers.
I have
Yeah.
a question. So I'm like new to all of this, so
Yeah.
please, so what is this compared to what Metro has? Because like I was in the Portland Freight Commission meeting yesterday, and like Metro sent, put out this document and it said, examine need of additional industrial land and availability and readiness of industrial lands. So like, is this cross-referencing with Metro, or is Metro something completely different that has its own separate thing and the city has its own separate thing? So they don't I'm a little confused.
Can you slide back to the side-by-side comparison?
I mean, I know that comparison, but
Yeah.
I'm confused.
So anything that's a ranking.
I guess, I think what the aim is that, so the overall kind of framework within which all the jurisdictions within the region, Metro puts out directives, sort of guidance, and each of the jurisdictions have to demonstrate their compliance. So they have this base methodology that they sort of their overarching process that they expect everyone at minimum to achieve. And we are then responding to that, and we did that, and we're determined to be in compliance to 2012, and that's what was shown in the previous slide. But so we just have to make sure that we are always maintaining compliance with Title 13. Technically, Metro has to make sure that all the jurisdictions continue to be compliant with Title 13, which is what's called nature and neighborhoods, which is they've identified for on a regional basis where those key natural resources are that require protection or, you know, compliance over there, sort of within their framework. But each city does different, uses different tools and use different approaches, and they just have to make sure they have to continue to be compliant. As things change, if we are making changes, we just need to make sure that we're still compliant with Metro's overarching guidance.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
And I mean, it's, you know, Metro's regional growth management functional plan, they say that you need to have adequate industrial land. So you have to plan for job growth the same way that we do with our goal 9 compliance. So that's part of the functional plan. And then Title 13 is kind of their goal 5, the way they address the natural resource protections. And they say that jurisdictions need to come up with a policy that addresses both of those simultaneously and finds a way to kind of split the baby in a way that's beneficial to everybody, ideally. But all of these features that we have mapped here on the right, that's part of Metro's Title 13, they have specific regulations that say that you need to limit development within those areas. They don't say that you need to prohibit development. They don't say that you need to like set these aside as resource protection areas, but they say that anything that's a ranking resource, you need to limit development, but allow for some development. And then the different, when it's a class 1 or a class 2, they say in class 2, you need to allow for some more development. And they're not extremely prescriptive about what limiting development is and what allowing a little bit more development is. They leave it kind of up to jurisdictions to do that, but we have to demonstrate through a plan that we are substantially compliant with those regulations to limit but allow some development. So they do have a model code, and jurisdictions could just adopt their model code and just have the specific regulations, but I don't think anybody's actually done that. I think all the jurisdictions in Metro have done their own flavor interpretation of Title 13 and demonstrated compliance.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
There is a filter though that's built in the Title 13. So you start out with these riparian rankings, but then they say on industrial lands, which are determined by Metro to be high value lands. The other really high development value lands are like the urban centers, the center of Portland. So it's like industrial areas and the urban centers. They apply a filter and they say the level of protection that you apply to these riparian resources is less than it would be anywhere else. So if these same resources were located on a residential site, they would get a higher level of protection. But on an industrial site, you have to protect them, but it's a lower level of protection is what their code says.
Gotcha.
Thank you for the question. Any others before Daniel moves on?
So yeah, so this is our buffer comparison, and it's tough to compare across jurisdictions because the rules and regulations are going to be totally different than Portland. So the way the code works is different, but they do have an area that's defined in their code, and they say the buffer has to be a specified width around those wetland features, and the buffers that we're applying fall within those ranges that they're doing. We don't necessarily use those categorizations of is it a degraded isolated wetland the way that that's written into the code for Seattle and Clean Water Services, but we can interpret that as saying that's probably a wetland that doesn't have any forest vegetation around it. When there's no forest vegetation, it's going to be a really small buffer. So that's how we tried to match up our buffer size with the terminology that's embedded in their code. Next slide, please.
One other thing
Yeah,
before,
go.
so just the note at the bottom, it looks like the two maximum and climate resilient are the same. This is just sort of ranges, and really the differentiation between those two when you get into the details and sort of what was summarized in that table is how much of the protection overlay zone is applied in the maximum protection scenario versus the climate resilient. We're more sort of moving toward the conservation overlay zone in the climate resilience is sort of the medium protection scenario as compared to more protection overlay zone that goes on to the maximum protection, maximum protection scenario.
And the conservation is our less restrictive of our E zones. It's something that you can develop if you go through an alternatives analysis and demonstrate a need. Whereas the protection, or through standards in some cases, yeah. And the protection zone is something that's for private development is typically a no build area. So that's the distinction. So there's more of that no build area in the maximum protection scenario versus the climate resilient. Yes.
Hopefully a quick question here.
Yeah.
Looking at the three scenarios there, minimum, climate resilient, maximum, there's very little difference between those three scenarios. And I know there's more difference. So can you, in one sentence, explain what that difference, why is there so little difference on this chart?
Yeah. So it's, I mean, the main difference is how much protection zone buffer you're getting these different scenarios. And also the minimum scenario is not applying any C zone to the medium ranked resources. So the medium ranking can extend out to 200 feet in some cases. In the client or the minimum scenario, we're not ever getting out to 200 feet under any circumstance. It's going to stop in most cases at 100 feet, and actually more often didn't get 50 feet. So that's one of the big distinctions. So that minimum scenario is having relatively small buffers that would be smaller than most of our peer city jurisdictions if we were to go with that. The climate resilient scenario is achieving, it's getting buffers that can go out to 200 feet in some cases. They rarely do. It's more like a 50 to 100 foot. So we are now getting these larger buffers in the climate resilient scenario. In terms of a difference in acreage, we're talking about like a 15-20% increase when we get to the climate resilient scenario in terms of the increase in E zones. And the other distinction is that the climate resilient scenario now has protection zone buffers that extend from the edge of the water features, which you don't get in the minimum scenario. So we're getting a no build area that's extending some distance away from the feature where there is almost no build area in that minimum scenario. And then the maximum protection scenario, you're getting a bigger E zone buffer around it. But in terms of the acreages, there's a little difference between the bottom two. They achieve the same acreage. It's just that the amount of area that's in that protection zone, that no build area, is bigger in the maximum scenario. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about whether these scenarios will achieve the biological opinion, the FEMA biological opinion?
Yes.
I don't think either of the first two come close. I'm not even sure the third one necessarily does, but it gets closer. And what the implications are of not meeting biological opinion.
It's a good point. These slides gloss over it, but that's actually built into all of the scenarios, is that we're applying a conservation zone within the unprotected floodplain outside of the MCDD jurisdiction, outside of PEN 1 and PEN 2. We are applying conservation zone between 0 and 170 feet, anywhere that's in the floodplain, the entire floodplain. So that's including developed areas, parking lots, buildings. If it's in the floodplain, the C zone is applying to the entire floodplain. And we believe that that's consistent with biological opinion. It's getting out to 170 feet. We're also building in specific code provisions that will address the riparian buffer area requirements, the requirements for additional landscaping on sites that don't currently have it as a criteria, or as within the standards process.
What about the mitigation ratios?
Those already are incorporated into the E zone, so that so basically the baseline floodplain protections that are kind of Title 13 directed actually cover a lot of the area, but to what Daniel's saying, any area that's in that 170 feet that is not covered by the base sort of methodology would include a conservation overlay zone. Part of this package for the E zone would be more the incorporation of the riparian buffer area requirements and into the E zone, which it doesn't exist. It exists in the river overlay zone for the central and the south reaches. We've gone through those previous projects, but so we would have similar requirements for those areas that we already have in the central and south reaches. And it would be focused on the lower slough and the Columbia River. And so what we've already, as a part of the floodplain resilience plan, we incorporated those higher ratios in terms of the tree replacement within the floodplain. So that already exists in the E zone, except for the 3 zones that were exempted, the industrial zones. And so that would also be that.
I'm talking about the trees. I'm talking about the balance cut and fill.
That's part of Title 24, and that actually already applies. What about industrial areas?
Well, for the industrial areas, that would be part of like sort of overall for the North Reach project. I mean, it does already exist, again, outside of those 3 zones. What's going to be going into effect in October, which was part of the Title 24 component of sort of the partner project that was for Title 24. Those will all go into effect for everywhere except the 3 industrial zones, so the North Reach and then I mean, basically like T6. Everything else will have those ratios applied that we had in the,
I know, but that is the question on the table is, are you going to apply those here? Those are in the biological opinion. So putting a C zone on it is a first step per se, but unless the mitigation is there, it doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. You know, if it's standard operating procedure, existing mitigation, from my perspective, you're not meeting the terms of the BIOP. Simply putting a C zone on there and requiring vegetation, the big issue is actually the mitigation ratios.
yeah, and that, so the EOA will account for that. I mean, we are in some of the slide, but one of the slides is about sort of our starting point and more specific for the North Reach, but for the industrial uses specifically. But because it's mainly in the North Reach, it would be part of the North Reach project. We just, those updates to the Title 24 components. I mean, we want to account for it in the EOA land capacity. But as a part of the North Reach plan, we would do it for, I mean, essentially, again, it'd be the North Reach and T6 is basically where we're talking about in terms of those sort of remaining areas where the IH zone is mostly specifically. And so those would be part of the North Reach project, and we're accounting for it in all of those estimates of constraints for the terminology that's used.
Of course, it could be more of that if the flood ballot measure doesn't pass and the entire Columbia corridor gets mapped back into the floodway.
That's true.
I mean, that's not.
Do we have more meetings ahead of us?
Well, and
I'm
again,
not making a joke here, though. We do have more meetings at the last, but I think it gets to the implications, and I don't know, go into a place that no one's thinking about, but that would change everything.
yes, although I mean, again, we still have the Title 24 requirements specifically identify those 3 zones. So I mean, it would be that anything outside of those zones, once that did happen, until we update and remove for Title 24, remove those exemptions for those 3 zones. Anything that is behind the levees that is now not officially behind the levees would be subject to the requirements.
Okay, thanks.
Want to do a time check. I'm not sure where you are, Daniel. We have 45 minutes left in the meeting.
Yeah.
I'm looking to Tom about that last.
Yeah, no, I think we can take a
Okay.
short break and then go to the North
Yeah,
Reach.
the North Reach stuff is pretty quick, I think.
All right, thank you all. Just wanted to.
But yes, we can just kind of quickly go.
One more slide. I think we can probably move over.
I mean, again, this just shows we're generally, I think everything you can look at it further, but we're generally consistent with those areas, with the peer cities that we looked at. I think that's kind
The
of,
one thing that I thought was interesting is Seattle is applying 100-foot buffers to all streams, regardless of whether there's vegetation there. Our minimum size is either 30 or 50 for these scenarios. And if there's vegetation that extends further, it goes out to 100 or 200 potentially. But I was interested to see Seattle's mapping because it's going right through the middle of neighborhoods. They've got, their houses and streets and driveways and all that stuff is fully covered by the 100-foot buffer. And so that was, it's something that I hear about with E-zones. Why is that E-zone going through my house, or why is it going through my building? It's pretty consistent with what Seattle's doing with streams as well, except for they're doing a bigger buffer than what we're doing in most cases.
I think it's a recognition of the science that buffers on streams need to be bigger and need to think about a bigger geographic area, albeit already developed. Nonetheless, in an age of climate change, we're going to see a hell of a lot more extreme weather events and a lot more, and we're already seeing it. I think it's a matter of recognizing reality that we need to be thinking about these sites differently.
Yeah, definitely. And I
They-
think there's some benefit to putting a buffer on an existing developed area because it ensures that future development is going to have a larger setback than what was proposed previously. And that does have impacts on existing development, but you're trying to get your intensification to be further away to account for the climate change, the higher flood levels, the greater impacts on natural resources.
In determining the floodplain, are you using the 96 flood and the current maps, or is it just the current maps?
yeah, for the zoning code, it's both 1996 and the 100.
And are you accounting for potential updates because part of the BIOP requires updating all those maps and remapping over time?
I mean, not as it stands right now because we don't have updates. I mean, we have, as you know, we did the 1996 model, and so we are using that as our best estimate of what that type of a storm will look like given current development patterns. But I think there is a larger kind of climate change question about what our future floods. I mean, I think right now we're just hoping for at some point in the next few years, a new FEMA 100-year floodplain that would actually account, like, be realistic, be, depict reality. And then the climate change piece is another part of it that goes beyond that. But from a FEMA perspective, just getting a new and sort of comprehensive look at the FEMA 100-year floodplain is a big step that hoping happens sometimes.
I agree with you 100%, and that's why I sued them.
Yes, exactly. And we were trying to push them previously, and we will continue to advocate for it. But the wheels move slowly.
But that question gets to another point that I think is important too, is that most of these jurisdictions, if not all, the regulations apply to all natural resources, even if they happen to be discovered at the time of development. So in Clean Water Services in Seattle, if there's a new stream that's just nobody ever saw before, wasn't on the map before, all these regulations automatically apply to the features at the time of discovery. The E-zones do not. In Portland, we have to identify these features, map them, put E-zones on them. If we don't do that, then the regulations don't apply. So these other jurisdictions have forward-looking code that allows for resource discovery, which is something we don't have. And that's one of the reasons it's critically important that we do this project to update our E-zone mapping, because we don't have the ability to just wait a few years and then discover these resources later on. We need to get the maps on the books now because the regulations don't apply outside of the E-zones.
Which I found interesting when I looked at the Clean Water Services regulations is for businesses and for a developer, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? You don't know what's going to apply until you go out and map it all and then go to Clean Water Services and say, this is what I found. Whereas we're doing all that mapping work up front, doing the maps, identifying the resources. I don't know, it's just a lot more information and a lot more, I think, certainty in Portland about where the regulations are going to apply.
We can probably move on. We'll skip the next slide. It's just inside baseball stuff.
So it's generally about process, and you can take a look at it, but really what types of things are covered and types of development and how some differences, some minor differences.
But this will all be available for later on. Yes, question.
Yeah, I just have a real quick question. What I thought I heard you say was that a Metro, Daniel, I think this is you're the one that said it. Metro applies a filter that says lower level of protection on industrial lands and I think city centers, something like that.
Yeah.
So how does what you're proposing here square up with that?
Yeah, so they say lower level. I mean, part of Portland is we have a blunt instrument that we have C-zone and P-zone. We don't have the fine nuance in there, but in general, the C-zone is consistent with what Metro requires for the lower value resources in industrial areas. The P-zone is a higher level of protection, and that's what we apply in the area immediately around the water features. We try to adjust these buffer widths to be consistent with the context of these industrial areas. And so in general, the proposals that we have here, especially the minimum scenario and especially the climate resilient scenario, are lighter application of E-zones than we do elsewhere in the city. We just finished up a citywide E-zone project that applied primarily in residential areas, and that was adopted in 2022. That was applying 50-foot P-zone buffers to all streams, all wetlands, and that would be consistent with that maximum scenario. But these other two scenarios that we have is a lighter application of E-zones, so it's not as restrictive. I feel like that's consistent with what Metro requirements are for protecting natural resources in industrial areas.
And I guess I would also say in terms of as we start to work through scenarios about what is the level and we're looking at these different sort of policy priorities and trying to balance the different considerations. I mean, that is part of it, so in terms of whatever comes out of it, we're thinking about other ways in which we can compromise and try to and still be consistent with Title 13, but achieve these other goals as well. That's kind of what this whole process is really about.
Yeah, and the scenarios that we have are not set in stone. They can be adjusted. It's just kind of there were some benchmarks that we wanted to put in there that kind of show a range of options, but we could end up somewhere in between those benchmarks. We're not beholden to those specific scenarios that we have right now.
Thank you. Any last questions on this for now? Okay. Can we take just like a 2-minute bio break, get some water? If you need to use the loo, do that and come right back. because we don't have a ton of time and I want to make sure we don't cut this last piece short as well. Great. So 11:54, please.
North Portland, getting screwed. Live in the villa? Where they go, they go.
I know you're not saying that exactly, but you're implying that.
I'm just not saying you don't, I'm just saying, you look at the data. Is it all right?
The workforce.
Now, where's she going? So she's going to teach
We'll be going.
but elementary. You want-
Obviously, right now.
Started already.
We wanted to go down.
Yes, there's just.
And asking us a question. Let me give a little bit of.
No, I don't. I just looked up inside here. Because they're pretty young people. They're pretty young for everyone. Okay, go ahead.
Where's the thing?
Well, I believe it. I'm not for it. Hi.
People said it is many years. It was just. The data should be here. If you can. Class, right now. Let's say. Our general. Reasons for graduating.
Let's come back together.
They get after pre-prevention is,
Yeah.
and they don't have to. Right.
Thank you to those online for your patience. Okay, Jeff,
Okay.
That's years.
questions remaining about outreach?
Yeah, there were some questions that we received just wanted to, and hopefully it can be relatively quick, so we have some additional time just to talk through kind of more like prepping for our next meeting, which is the scenarios. But so we kind of, this is sort of generally, I think, the kind of four main questions that we took, and I think it's mostly about the North Reach, really about what is the relationship between existing regulations and those that we would be considering. Again, this project will start at some point. Right now, our focus is we want to make sure the EOA kind of takes account of what is potentially any changes in regulations. What are the North Reach regulations look like in comparison to the Central and South Reach, which are already in effect. If you remember, I did a presentation, we did this a few months ago, at the end of, I think it was December actually, how impacts be considered for individual sites, and then just sort of generally about the process and stakeholder engagement. So go ahead. Tom. So just a little bit about the existing regulations. One of the questions that we received was sort of like, what's the relationship with the Greenway overlay zone, the river overlay zone, things like Title 11, our tree code, that sort of thing. So just so we're clear, the idea would be that we are replacing, so the Greenway overlay zone, the North Reach is the last vestige of the Greenway overlay zone. That was applied to the entire Willamette in the city back in the 80s. We have been in a process of replacing it. The North Reach would be the last area that still has Greenway overlay zone, so that would be totally removed from our zoning code, and we would then apply what is called the river overlay zone, which is the what is currently applied in the Central and South Reach. Just a couple of like highlights of what that river overlay zone has. I think what we want to say, and I mean in terms of that question about. And there's also this, I have a slide or two about, maybe a slide about Title 24, the cut fill requirements, but just, like the Central and South Reach is really the starting point. We recognize the differences we've talked about in the past of the North Reach. And so there are pieces that we would want to make sure that what is currently in the river overlay zone makes sense for the industrial area. And that is very much sort of a revisiting of things. And as necessary, we would develop, as we've talked about in the past, some standards or things like that, but the benefits or the opportunities that are part of the river overlay zone, more clarity on what's exempt. And I mean, a big one is fewer discretionary reviews, because essentially right now in the North Reach, almost everything has to go through a land use review. There's basically a landscape standard and that's it. Anything else you're doing goes through Greenway review. So there would be a lot more opportunity to meet the standards, or especially with the application of the river environmental, only really know exactly where those resources are, where those types of reviews might be triggered, as compared to right now, the approach is it covers the entire site, and anywhere in the Greenway overlay zone, you trigger a review. So we already have a number of standards that are in there. We would think about developing some more, as I said, and I think specifically industrial related. And then one big thing too, so the discretionary review that does happen, the Greenway review, is very dependent on this very old kind of antiquated Greenway design guidelines. And, so it's a little bit, again, less rigor than what we would hope to have that is in the river overlay zone. Again, hopefully more clarity on what the expectations are, especially when you have to go through a land use review. And then there is a river industrial, as most of you know, there is a river industrial overlay zone that's in the Greenway overlay. We would basically be looking, unless as we get through this, we determine it's not useful, but we assume that the river industrial overlay zone will still be useful. And a big part of our project, the North Reach project, will be to define that river industrial overlay in addition to the other components of the river overlay zone that would be applied. Next slide. So right now, again, the starting point and what we do in the Central and South Reach is the river environmental is applied at minimum to, it's applied to the setback, sort of to Bob's point, the floodplain requirements, that's the 170 feet from ordinary high water. That is part of the biological opinion requirements that we have in effect in the Central and South Reach. And then beyond that, there's only be applied to identify natural resources, high and medium ranked resources that we talked about through the methodology today. There was a question about how it interfaces with Title 11. So outside of those areas, Title 11 applies everywhere. So technically, I guess if there's, so again, going to for the natural resources, when we talked about that half acre, say you're removing an individual tree or two, you still have to meet Title 11. And currently you have to meet Title 11, but because Title 11 exempts, say, for example, the IH zone, you don't have preservation or planting requirements for those areas. If that continues into the future, you would still have no requirements, but it does apply out, it would apply outside of the river environmental, because that's where we have specific tree regulations. But right now, again, it's exempt. Next slide. And so just, I wanted to have a little bit of a reminder. So this question of,
We don't know what's happening.
read fast. So just a little bit about the other part of it is now, but anyhow, we have these flood storage requirements, which were also part of the biological opinion, and that we reviewed that in December, but basically what we, again, the central, what is going to be, what is applied, and really what starts in October, because it was a delayed implementation, and we would sort of, you know, in terms of the date for implementation of many of this, we have to get through the whole project. We'll talk about process, but then also there is often some time between adoption and implementation. But anyhow, so what we have for the Title 24 requirements is that it was very much the changes were focused on the FEMA 100-year floodplain for the Title 24 requirements, because that technically is the purview of FEMA. And that is technically the requirement of the biological opinion is about it mapped on FEMA 100-year floodplain. We have these higher ratios. The closer you are to the river, the higher the ratio. As you can see on the right, this is a residential area, but you know, it's just representative. And then a big piece of it, in addition to those changes in the ratios, was that it's not just placement of fill, which is what our current requirement is, and it's a metro requirement, but it now any placement of structure in those areas have to be offset to those ratios. So that's a change. But again, what exactly it looks like in the North Reach, and I think you can go ahead one more. So the other piece of it is to what Bob said about the 1996 map. So we, in the Central and South Reach, we maintain the current requirements in the 1996. So outside of the FEMA 100-year floodplain, or if there's a depth difference between this 1996, we kept the requirements, which is really, it's focused on fill and it's balanced. It doesn't go above the 1-to-1, which is again the metro requirement. We have to maintain compliance, sort of to this question about metro and their role for the natural resources. In the same way for flood storage, they have a minimum requirement, which is the 1-to-1. We also, in the recent update to Title 24 allowance, more direct codification of the allowance of flood storage mitigation bank as a credits to be purchased offsite to meet these requirements. Next slide. Oh, and I guess in terms of this question of sort of individual site impacts before we move on, really, I mean, part of the North Reach project, we are looking at individual sites, and for all of these considerations, I mean, it's part of the question about what the final mix of requirements in the North Reach will be as a part of the application of the river overlay zone and other components of the project. But so we are looking at individual sites and thinking about any complications that would come from those changes and trying to then sort of tailor our proposals to meet those. I think one of the things related to floodplain in the North Reach, there are a handful of sites that have significant floodplain, but for the most part, it's pretty narrow to the waterway as we've shown in the past. Then the last thing was just about our outreach, sort of the process that we go by. This would be a legislative project. So one of the things I think that there might be a misunderstanding because we are talking about it now, that it's about to go into effect. We are looking at this as like a 2-year, hopefully 2-year project. Again, this first year is sort of existing conditions, making sure that the EOA somehow acknowledges any additional, the changes and regulations that might come out of it, but still, we would be continuing to work through it. So it's sort of like this first year, hopefully 2024 is really informing the EOA, initial discussions and things like that. And then that second year would be getting to the details of what does that river industrial overlay look like? What exactly, what are the changes that may need to be made inside in the river overlay zone to kind of better address the North Reach, et cetera. And so, as we always do, we do some initial outreach, have some open houses, et cetera, do a discussion draft goes out to the public, and then they provide the feedback to us at the city. Then we update based on that feedback. Then it goes to the planning commission. You are able to testify there. And then they tell us what to do about it. And then it goes to the city council. So we don't expect that this project would be done before, say, the end of 2025, I think, if we were lucky. I mean, hopefully we can do that. But so, and then once it's adopted, as I said, there's still some time after adoption. At minimum, right now, Bureau of Development Services only implement packages, code packages twice a year in March and October. So depending on the timing of the adoption, the earliest it would be the following March or October. So it's still, even after adoption, there's going to be likely some time before it goes into effect. And as was done for the floodplain resilience plan, city council has the ability to say it's not going to go into effect this March. It'll go in a year and a half. So the next March or whatever they decide to do, they have the ability to do that. But again, all of this is sort of the starting point. What we presented in December, what I presented in December is really like the starting point of where these discussions are. And then we will continue to have stakeholder engagement and figure out the details of it over the next couple of years.
And in the meantime, the EOA is gonna think about some assumptions.
That's right. And we want to try to make
May or may
those,
not be accurate.
yeah, we hope they're accurate-ish. And then what we really want, unfortunately, it may not be the best idea, but we want it to be conservative so that, again, because we don't want to underestimate the impact, although currently I think right now, really, there's no BLI sites in the North Reach as it stands right now. So, but nonetheless, that we've identified. But we don't want it to be to where we go through this whole process and then whatever comes out of the North Reach plan, all the capacity is then absorbed through that and we're back where we are now. We want to make sure that there's enough assumption of infrastructure capacity that when those regulations go into effect, we are still not back to like this whole 9 argument all over
Which
again.
is why we're having the conversation here.
That's right.
Context that those assumptions that will feed into the process in the future are hopefully going to be generally understood through this process. And that will be the launching point for that discussion.
Questions about North Reach?
Do we have the latest building land inventory data? We have that, like how much industrial land you say we have versus how much you say we need. My concern has always been that this process is a justification for increasing industrial land. And it's not that I am against that, but I live in North Portland and I looked at this map and there's a lot more vacant land. And I mean, philosophically, I believe that an urban area should have small 1 to 3 acre industrial jobs and that we need to reuse and recycle the industrial land we have. And I know that somebody said just because there's a sign out doesn't mean that it's vacant, but if you drive by for 4 years and so nobody has moved in, then you can begin to think over 4-year time that it's indeed vacant. And, I have it all in charts, what's vacant. It has not changed in about 4 years. So I just want to make sure that there's a philosophy of reusing our industrial land. And we haven't really talked about our philosophy, but a philosophy that we're not going to just sit and let this property sit empty forever. And that becomes a philosophy and we seek out industry and jobs small businesses, whatever, that want to use our urban core in a way that's appropriate for people having jobs next to neighborhoods. We can't pretend that our industrial acres are not in neighborhoods. And I think that we have to have a philosophy that their industrial acres are in a neighborhood. They've always been in a neighborhood, and that we can make the most of that. We can look at that in a really beautiful, positive way. And I think also the comprehensive plan says to reduce wage discrepancy. And I would love to see, Steve, in addition to looking at the age of the warehouse jobs and transportation jobs, how long they're staying in those jobs. And also the wage discrepancy. Like, what is the wage discrepancy of these middle income jobs? So Steve, like, who's making at the top and what's being made at the bottom? And then, you know, what Benton said, what is the path for rising up in that employment so that it becomes not a summer job? I mean, a lot of the warehouse people I know, they're like summer or whatever, they're temporary. And, you know, what are the middle wage jobs that are careers? And I understand at Vigor, that is what you do. And I do know that there's room for, you know, I know that there are jobs in the industrial sector where people can get training. And I just would like to analyze that in terms of the warehouse jobs. Like, what is the training and what is the job growth in that sector?
Thank you. I do want to thank you, Sarah. I want to move us along and I see two up, so go ahead.
I'm just wondering how many, I saw you had something in there about mitigation. We've touched on this before. North Reach is different than the other reaches fundamentally. And so I'm wondering if that's part of our discussion moving forward is, should we and how could we have mitigation sites play a bigger role so that we allow that industrial use in the North Reach, but say, but if you're going to do that, we need your contribution into this set aside, robust natural area. That fit into your plans? And
It does. And we have, the city has been doing a lot of work, I think, related to the floodplain resilience plan, but also just generally, you know, there's East Bank Crescent, which is over the OMSI site. There, we've been doing a lot of due diligence, the city, primarily your environmental services on that. I think from our perspective, from BPS's perspective, especially talking about land constraints and sort of what I think Patricia was saying, where as cities grow and we just don't have a lot of land to go to, we think that mitigation banks will become increasingly important. And so I think that's and as we talk about the North Reach, it will be that conversation will continue because we want to identify options. One of the challenges, you know, a fee in lieu would be an option related to the Endangered Species Act. As we understand it, that's not legally allowed, but sort of how can we make that something, how can we do these types of things to, again, provide options for development, both industrial and housing, because we in the central city, we have a lot of goals related to that. So how can we provide these different options for meeting mitigation?
so how does this group help further that conversation right there? Or do you need any help?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know necessarily. I guess one of the questions would be, again, if we're talking about what the function of the EOA is, I guess it's a question as to whether in the suite of things that we're doing to help alleviate and to increase the industrial acreage, and I would sort of, I guess, defer to Tom and Steve, but sort of like how and what is that? Is it part of that mix, and what needs to be kind of clarified about that to inform what the benefits are for industrial acreage? I think for sure, again, as part of this more specifically the North Reach project, we will continue. And we are looking even in the E zone, in the corridor and in the environmental overlay zone, more generally looking to also provide that opportunity for mitigation banks. There's not as much of an opportunity at this point to do that or away from the Columbia and the Willamette, but that's another piece again, in this sort of overarching desire to provide options throughout the city to utilize mitigation banks and other offsite mitigation options. Incorporating the allowances in the environmental zone as well is another piece of it for us, although I think, like I said, the opportunity there right now is more limited than, say, on the Willamette.
To your point, I mean, I think we're about to go into a conversation about the potential different scenarios that we'll look at. And I mean, we talk about a scenario that looks at how investment in the various constraints can help increase the ability, the capacity and the ability to use the industrial land. So this mitigation bank idea might actually roll into being one of those types of investments that need to be made in order to unlock opportunity in the existing investment.
Yeah, and my interest is, I, just as you said, I see real potential, and maybe we as a city are at a point where we really need to do that more, and there's added value in that. I think that's my personal gut feeling. So we may be at a point where we need to turn a little bit away from the E-zone conversation we just had and more toward the mitigation bank conversation. You see what I mean? To meet those natural resource goals is what I'm thinking. And so I'm a little bit worried that maybe we're missing that opportunity for a really good, useful, productive discussion right now. And next year we may kick ourselves for it, sort of thing.
Please.
A couple of things. I do think we need to think about the mitigation bank approach, but I also think we need to remember that salmon have to pass through Portland Harbor, and you can put the mitigation bank over there, but they're still going through Portland Harbor, and there's also a lot of other reasons, floodplains, and so on. I would note on that in the last planning process for River Plan, that was the discussion, and it was industrial interests, in particular the Port of Portland and Schnitzer Steel, that rejected that approach and wanted to stick with a zoning type based approach. So I'm happy to go down that road again, but I think it's important because the environmental side was the one that was interested in that. The industrial side was less so. I just want to flag one other thing too, which is we're talking a lot about large industrial sites, and this seems to be the challenge that is before us. How do we protect and create large industrial sites? And unfortunately, what I see is the rhetoric about that is not always matched by the reality of how the city performs. And we just went through a recap process, which is minor code amendments. By definition, recap is minor code amendments, in which the city brought forward a proposal on riverfront sites to allow them to no longer be completely river dependent uses, which means if you have multiple sites within the multiple parcels in the sites, you can now use the back parcels for other purposes. That is a strategy for disassembling large sites. I mean, and it was going to be applied on all the remaining ones on public lands. It was reduced, and I appreciate that, to just Terminal 2. Terminal 2 is the largest site that's open on the river. And yet we just, and I understand why the port wanted to do it, but we just created a situation where the largest site on the river is likely to have different uses in the back and the front, which is a recipe for disassembling that site and also potentially leaving small orphans right next to the river. That was done through a recap process, which is a minor code amendment. We cannot be having this conversation in this room and that conversation in the recap process. And we have brought this up year in and year out, that we do all these things in the name of accommodating a specific interest that results in the loss of these sites. And then we pit it against the environment. And so I cannot fathom how we just did that, frankly, given this conversation, and did it as a minor code amendment. It's not minor. It is the biggest challenge we have on the Willamette River in this city.
I hope everybody understands what he's saying, is that the big site was divided into little sites. And then we're here saying we need more big sites.
So the big site wasn't divided into little sites. There was the opportunity.
Well,
the code created an opportunity for public owned lands, and it ended up being tailored to the one site. And I understand that. I think it is also true that we know that the, sites that there's often in any operations, different kinds of uses. There can be sites that have true genuine riverfront uses and also have other kinds of functions going on the site. And you need that kind of flexibility. So that being said, I mean, that is why I think I agree with you completely. That's why we were really, kind of open to the idea of keeping that as narrow as possible and trying to make sure that this conversation is happening.
And I appreciate that, but that only happened because there was pushback on the city on that. And so I just, because those things seem to happen a lot and they happen quietly and no one tracks them really in this context. But I think that's also, we put the, prime industrial land overlay over these sites to make sure, and that was a decade ago, to make sure that we didn't do small things incrementally that ultimately undermine the integrity of what we have left. And I just look at this as a classic example of doing just that. And I'm not saying the port wasn't right. I mean, I understand exactly why they're doing it, but we can't accommodate those things on a micro basis and then have this conversation here. If 50-acre sites on the river are really, really, really important, we just lost the only one we have left.
Well, I think the conversation we've been having is about large sites in general, not necessarily just along the river. So I just want to be clear on that. I mean, obviously, large sites anywhere are important. But the conversation we were having is not about, because I think warehouse uses don't believe are allowed on the.
Yeah, but that also is something that hasn't been fully vetted through this process, because the last time I was involved in EOA, it was about large sites on the river. We heard from industry very, very clearly that the stress point was large river industrial sites. And I remember it wasn't large sites that was the biggest deficit in the city. It was large river industrial sites. That's 2016. It's now 2024. Times may have changed, but we haven't actually said that times have changed yet. We're in a process to do that. So we shouldn't be front loading these kinds of things in advance of this process that we just did. And we almost did it at a much larger scale, and the community missed it. The honest truth is the community missed it because we weren't tracking recap for that purpose. And only at the last minute did I catch it and said, whoa, what the hell are we doing here? And then we backed off of it. But, I look to staff on something like that to make sure that we don't have these flybys.
Thank you, Bob. Benton, we have 5 minutes left in the meeting. I'm going to come to you in a second, Tom, to resolve how.
I'll go quick. Bob, let's have that conversation about the future of independent policy. Happy to have it with you. I will reiterate the point that Patricia made. There are more 50-acre sites on we run a 60-acre site that has 3 uses on it. So I think it is important that even if we were to split up our land, that doesn't necessarily mean we're doing something totally different on it. And in our instance, it's one zone area, but we have 3 uses, right? We have a fabrication use and we have a riverfront use, and then we had some previous use for the tanks that we don't use anymore, right? But that's 3 separate uses in one 60-acre facility. So I just want to make sure we're having a practical conversation about what's happening in some of these facilities when we talk about, I think something that is very important that you are bringing up, and actually something that we have discussed as part of this process that we would be happy to get into a discussion with you about what the future of that policy looks like on private lands.
Sure. And I think we should have it. And I'm agnostic to some degree on that. And I agree, we need to get to practicality. But I think in this room, we tend to be in theoretical universe, and suddenly this big 50-acre vacant parcel looms large. The reality is something different, but the policy they have to sync up at some point.
Be careful of chipping away the Central East Side is, I think, an example of what you're describing too. We put the EX zone on Central East Side and said, well, it's still industrial. No, it's not, job wise, in terms of who has those jobs, it's not. I'm sorry, because we provided some flexibility there. And on one hand, it looked great, but it had some unintended consequences. You're absolutely right, Bob. Completely agree.
You might find some area of agreement here. It's what
That would be nice to say. Find some areas.
I just want to say one thing is the CAG meeting this week is going to be a speaker from Eugene that's going to be talking about Eugene's new public health overlay zone. So if anybody wants to hear about public health overlay zones on industrial acres, that's what Eugene adopted. So we're going to be looking at what a public health overlay looks like.
Thank you, Sarah. Tom. I
Well,
want to resolve this issue we never got to.
Well, no, I mean, I think it is part of what we bring back to the May meeting, in terms of alternatives, which is how do we cobble together these different trade-offs and, you know, one of the things, you know, like the quality of warehouse jobs is like, if we're being asked to do less in environmental protection, what are we getting? Are those quality jobs? You know, are they there? Is that where the growth has been? Are they gonna show up? Or, you know, other things that, you know, so if we go a higher level of protection, what does that mean in terms of the impact to the land supply and what do we get? Or as we talked about 1 or 2 meetings ago, the investment piece. If we do more in brownfield cleanup, or we do more in infrastructure investment, how does that swing the opportunity or the availability of sites? Yeah, Sarah, there's lots of sites available in the port harbor. A lot of them are super dirty, right? They're never, some of them are never gonna get cleaned up. But some of them with Superfund or brownfield or some infrastructure could be activated. And so I think what we'll get at the alternatives is a range of choices. A little bit of investment, a lot of investment, a little bit of environmental regulation, a lot of environmental regulation. And be able to see sort of a continuum of how you piece those different policy choices together to create different packages. And where do we wind up? What economic opportunity results from those packages? And again, it's just the starting point to figure out how to fit both policy goals together. The economic opportunity and natural resource.
Cassie, I see your hand up. Give me a second. Tom, our next meeting is May 10th.
10th.
Do you have adequate time to send out a package of information before May 10th?
We will send out the information before the meeting. And we will work over the next 2 weeks to see if we can do that by May 10th.
Great. And if not, we'll talk about it. Reschedule.
Yes.
We have to.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Cassie, please.
Can you commit to sending it out at least 3 full days before the meeting?
Oh,
we have
absolutely.
Adequate time, yeah. Ideally a week ahead of time.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Cassie. That's a very generous request, but yeah, I think a week is the aim. And
Yes.
within the next couple of weeks, BPS will have had time to figure out whether that's possible by May 10th or week before May 3rd. And if not, we'll be in touch about rescheduling. Any last questions or comments? Do you have your hand up?
Nope.
Okay, sorry. Thank you all. I want to thank you especially for being really honest and forthright with your frustrations, concerns. I'm sorry that's the situation. I know staff are committed to doing better, but it's really important to air those concerns. So I really appreciate that. I'm sorry we had to go there. Thank you all. We'll be in touch, either confirming that May 10th is on or that we need to reschedule. Appreciate it.
Thank you.